So, I'm going to give a summary of the entire book of Esther. It's a really great story to read, powerful message for all of us, because there are times in our life when we feel like we can't see that God is at work, but God is always at work. And the story of Esther is one of those moments where the name of God is not mentioned at all in the book, but the evidence of the hand of God at work is powerful throughout the story. This is what we're told in the book of Esther. Now, the people of God, they lived in the city of Susa, and they were under the king Xerxes. Now, King Xerxes, he was known for his wine, his wealth, his wrath, and his women. And he loved to throw these huge, massive, pompous parties where he paraded his prestige and his power amongst all the people. And at one of these parties, it lasted 180 days. And one night he got really drunk with wine and he demanded that his queen come bearing her crown and showing her beauty off to his merry men. Well, she gave a royal refusal, and so he, in his wrath, removed her crown and her position. But when his wrath and his wine abated, he missed his queen. So his advisors came up with a plan where he would throw a huge beauty pageant from all the provinces that he oversaw across the land. And they would bring in all the young virgin maidens into the king's harem so that he could choose the queen that pleased him. And this pleased the king. Now, in the land, there was a man, his name was Mordecai, and he was raising his young little cousin named Esther. Now, she was beautiful, no more than 14 years of age. And so when he heard of this beauty pageant, he commanded her, tell no one that you are a Jew. And then off she went without her consent to become a part of the king's harem. And she began beauty treatments and essential oils that lasted for an entire year until one night it was her night to go and be in the king's bed. And she pleased the king. And so he put the crown on her head. And that is how a young foreign maiden became the queen of the Persian nation. Now, Mordecai every day would go out into the king's courtyards and he would pace, hoping to get news of Queen Esther. And one night, he overheard two men that were plotting to kill the king. And so he told Esther. And Esther told the king, and the king's life was saved. And the King's Chronicles wrote that those two men fell on the gallows that day. Well, in the land there was another man. Now, this man's name meant celebrated one. And it was the king's rule that everyone was to bow before the celebrated one when he passed by. But whenever he would go by the king's gates, Mordecai would stand tall and not bow. Now, some servants stood at the king's gate, and week after week, they saw that Mordecai would not bow when the celebrated one passed by. And they kept asking, why? And eventually, Mordecai gave in, and he said, because I'm a Jew. Well, off they went in haste to go tell the celebrated one. And when he heard this, he was so furious that the fate of one was not enough for him. He wanted to annihilate all of them. So off he went to the king, and he offered the king an unforgivable sum to annihilate an entire people group. Well, the king, with a wave of his hand, said, forget your money. But he gave him his ring and his signature instead, that said on a fateful date that all of them would be annihilated. Well, the edict was written and it went out all across the land. Everyone was in confusion, and the Jews were ripping their clothes in mourning. And the king and the celebrated one sat and drank wine. Mordecai was at the king's gate with his clothes ripped, and he was wailing and crying. And when Esther overheard, she wanted to know why. And Mordecai sent news to her that the edict said all Jews must die. You must go to the king to save our people. Well, when Esther heard this news, she sent back, Mordecai, you know the law says no one shall enter the king's halls except if they are called. It's been 30 days since I've entered those walls. And Mordecai replied, do not think that because you are in the palace, you are safe. You will have the same fate. Maybe you are here for such a time as this. And upon hearing this, Esther felt resignation inside her, and she said, fast for 3 days, and then I will go. And if I perish, I perish. So after 3 days, Esther put on her royal robes and her royal crown, and she went and stood in front of the royal throne. And to her surprise, she pleased the king, and he put out his royal scepter to her. Esther, what do you want? Up to half my kingdom it is yours, he said. And she said, if it please the king, I would like to invite you and the celebrated one to a feast to my hall. And so that evening, the king and the celebrated one went to feast with Esther, and she gave them exactly what they wanted, wine and prestige. And for a second time, the king said, Esther, what is it you want? Up to half my kingdom it is yours. And she said, if it please the king, I would like to invite you and the celebrated one back to a feast tomorrow night. Well, that night, the celebrated one left all full of himself. But when he passed by the king's gate, Mordecai stood tall and did not bow when he passed by. So when he went in to his family and friends, he said, I have everything you could want. I have sons, I have land, and I feast in the king's hall with the king and the queen. But if it weren't for that Mordecai, that man. And his wife and his friends said, build a gallows 75 feet tall and let that be Mordecai's fall. And that pleased the celebrated one. Well, that night in the palace, the king couldn't sleep. And he asked for the king's chronicles to be brought and read to him. And the servant just happened to open and read about the day that Mordecai saved him. And the king said, what was done for Mordecai? Nothing, said the servant. And the king said, who is out in the hall? And as fate would have it, in entered the celebrated one to ask for Mordecai's fall. Bring him in, the king said. And he asked him, what should I do for the one that I want to honor? The celebrated one thought, who but I would the king want to honor? And so he said to him, well, if it please the king, you should dress him in your royal robes and put him on your royal stallion. He should be paraded around town as they shout, this is what is done for the one who the king wants to honor. And the king said, good, go and do that for Mordecai the man. And off the celebrated one went and dressed Mordecai in the royal robes and put him on the royal stallion and paraded him around town, shouting, "This is what is done for the one the king wants to honor." And when they were done, Mordecai went back to the king's gate and sat, while the celebrated one went home in lament. And his wife and his friends said, "That Mordecai, he will be your downfall." And just then entered the servant and said, "Please come to Esther's hall." And that night at the feast, Esther gave them everything they wanted. She gave them wine and prestige. And for a third time, the king asked Esther, "Esther, what is it that you want? Up to half my kingdom, it is yours." And Esther said, "If it please the king, would you save me and my people? For an edict has been written to annihilate us all." And the king, ignorant of what he had done, said, Who would do such a thing?" And Esther said, "Haman, that wicked one." In his anger and rage, the king went out in the courtyard, while Haman, the celebrated one, fell at Esther's feet defeated. And in walked the king and shouted, "And you would molest my queen?" And then the servant said, "You know, there is a gallows 75 feet tall that he intended for Mordecai's downfall." And the king said, "Let that be Haman's downfall." And when the deed was done, the king's anger abated. But there was one more secret that needed to be revealed. Esther told the king, "Mordecai's my cousin. Will you please keep my people from being killed?" And the king said, "You know my signature cannot be undone. But take my ring and do what you must do on that fateful date to make it be undone." And so Mordecai and Esther wrote an edict that day, declaring that all the Jews could defeat their enemy and fight until they were defeated that day. And all across the land, the Jews fought long and hard, day 1, day 2, day 3. Finally, they celebrated in Jubilee because the enemy was defeated. The enemy will come to steal, kill, and destroy. But when it comes to God's plan, it will not be stopped. It will even be fulfilled if he has to use a young foreign maiden in a land where she's exiled. But this true story, it's a part of a grander tale. See, there's an edict that is written that says, the wages of sin is death. But God had a plan, and he sent his one and only Son, that if you believe in him, it will erase that edict, and you will live forever with him in oneness. May God honor the telling of his word. Shalom, y'all.